Thank you. I suppose I can give a little bit of an introduction about myself. I run a contemporary art gallery after my name, which is Kai Matsumiya. And the ways that we got here, that is with Bernard Harcourt giving us a presentation on cooperation, is that while Essye was working on this beautiful show, Press and Pull, one of its major hallmarks here is that there's a certain emphasis on its 80-plus year history, but even goes before that, even dating back to the New Deal, where Robert Blackburn was a recipient of these artist stipends under the Workers' Public Administration, WPA. And for me, when I saw Essye working on the show, she was keeping in mind the many different modes of organization, cooperative ethos, and the number of challenges it faced throughout its 80-plus year history. During that time, I had an exhibition myself with Craig Kalpatchian, who's right here, in a show called How Can We Live Together? And in that show, it was a composite of a number of thoughts, kind of displayed like a commonplace books, where there were a number of thinkers really investigating not just that question, but somewhat under the umbrella theme of, you may know this book called Dawn of Everything by Graeber and Wengrau, where he urges us to think about the different types of ways that pre-modern society had organized the ways in which they were able to endure for so many years, and the kinds of areas that we can look at directly questioning this idea that the nation state is inevitable. Anyways, from there, he introduced me to Bernard Harcourt's book, Cooperation. And there are a few quotes that were on that commonplace-like installation. A commonplace book is this kind of a thing that people did in the Victorian era, where they would scribble a number of notes, whims, thoughts, and things of that nature, and kind of plaster it out in the book. So that show is called Dawn of Everything. There, I acquainted Essye with that book, Cooperation, keeping in mind that while she was working on this exhibition, about those very kinds of themes that Bernard was addressing. So how we're going to do this, I thought, because these are very monumental topics, and we'll keep it more focused, is that given the themes of this exhibition, which is very much about its very special social history, cultural history, and the ways that they organized shared resources over such a long passage of time, that some of the macro themes that we can talk about, right? We can go in many different directions. I think Bernard will address it in the ways that he does. That given the spirit and the message of this exhibition, which focuses on the last 20 years, but under the greater historical framework of the last 80 years, that will first start with a presentation by Bernard Harcourt, and then we'll move more and more towards the everyday activities of the Robert Blackburn Printmaking Workshop. And then I thought of a question here, so we'll have some guideposts, in other words. I'm going from the macro to micro, if you will. And we urge the audience and ourselves that we'll start to have this question in the back of our minds, which is, how does a small cooperative art workshop help us imagine larger political or social possibilities? So with that said, I'll hand it off to you, Bernard.
Thank you, Kai, and thank you, Kai, and thank you, Essye, for inviting me. And I prepared a more formal talk, but I'll work off of it since we're a nice community here and try not to make it as formal as it would have been otherwise. So I think that one of the things that shines through in this exhibit here at the James Gallery, Press and Pull, but also really comes through when you walk into the print workshop, which I encourage you all to go visit on 39th Street, right, is the fact that it's really are the bonds of solidarity that one feels that were formed at the Robert Blackburn Printing Workshop, and how much this is really a tribute to the art of collaboration. Over the course of decades, as we see reflected here, and of course it goes much further back to 1947, the workshop, the print workshop, became a community space, a cooperative, actually, at times, a home for artists who were largely cast out of the mainstream art scene in New York City because of de facto segregation, because of racism and sexism. And so the studio became an open workshop formed in 1947, first with a single lithography press. It was open particularly to Black artists who were struggling to find community in an art world that was still segregated. It was open to everyone, regardless of race, gender, and creed, and it became a hub of artistic expression, a community space for all types of artistic activities, including forms of apprenticeship on different printmaking machines, open studio times, classes, and then the production of editions for other artists. And of course, you've seen the lists of artists who participated and who were part of it, and it's a stunning list. It's stunning. And what emerged, right, from this collective gathering of artists was the first interracial community-based print shop. I think one of the first in the country, and maybe one of the oldest now, and one of the longest running community print shops. Now, at first, it was sustained piecemeal by Robert Blackburn, but then it evolved somewhat organically, though organic never means without struggle, of course, into a cooperative operating through membership dues. It was, of course, a struggle for the workshop to stay afloat financially, and it was almost about to close. And so I was told a fellow artist and printmaker, James Koppelman, I think it was, came up with the idea and devised the plan to turn the workshop into a member cooperative with annual dues. That was in 1956. And it took on the formal character of a cooperative, and it operated as such from 1956 to 1971, when it then became a nonprofit organization, now under the auspices of the Elizabeth Foundation for the Arts. Now, the history of the transformation into a cooperative was, I suggest, an organic process through struggle that maps on remarkably well and beautifully to the writings and the praxis of W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, Du Bois was a strong proponent of cooperatives in the Black community. At an early date, as a young researcher in 1907, actually, Du Bois had spearheaded a voluminous and meticulous study of cooperative institutions in African-American communities across the country. The study, which was published under the title Economic Cooperation Among Negro Americans, traced the history of cooperation as far back as pre-colonial Africa, the West Indies, and the American colonies, and then it started cataloging its history during the antebellum period, focusing a lot on the Underground Railroad. And then he surveyed every institution existing at the time, at the turn of century, that were based on cooperative principles in the African-American communities. Hi, Sergio. Du Bois broke them down by type and industry, discussing everything from African-American churches and schools to Black secret societies, insurance mutuals and banks, worker and producer cooperatives in the African American communities. And so he cataloged them all by the names, and he would give their detailed description of where they were, what they were doing. It's a remarkable compilation. And of course, the ambition, Du Bois's ambition, was to show how much cooperation there was in the African American communities throughout the United States. And he developed this argument on its basis for a separate Black economy of cooperatives, separate from mainstream white society. He wanted to foster cooperatives within African American communities and to develop a whole society, a whole economy based on cooperatives, separate from the white world. He wrote this up in an article that he published. He gave a lecture about it in 34. He published it in 35 in the journal Current History. It's titled A Negro Nation Within the Nation, where he advocates for a separatist cooperative movement. And of course, the idea was to no longer depend, he wrote, on the salvation of a white God, his words, but instead to achieve, in his words, a new economic solidarity. And so that was the way that he was, of course, confronting the racism that plagued even the workers' movements and the labor unions at the time, which excluded African Americans. What he was trying to do was foster then different kinds of associations, different economic models. Now, in many ways, I felt that Robert Blackburn's community print shop was a kind of organic manifestation of that ambition of Du Bois. He turned to forms of cooperation as a way to deal with segregation and exclusion. So for him, coming together, working together in cooperation in spaces that were open and non-exclusionary was a way to fight against the rigid racial lines that delimited possibilities, particularly productive in the printmaking context. And that's the second point I wanted to make. The fact that this exhibit, Press and Pull, it instantiates in its very essence something about the inherent features of art making and perhaps printmaking in particular that bend towards cooperation or cooperative institutions. Just in terms of the equipment, right? And the printing presses alone, they're these hefty, expensive pieces of equipment that almost call out to be used in common. In the very same way, I mean, they're basically a common good, or can be. Of course, they can be privatized as well, but in their very character, there's almost a nature of the common good, just like agricultural cooperatives share tractors or combines, right, or other equipment, which can be used at all times by different farmers instead of laying fallow while one individual isn't working their field. So the printing presses lend themselves to forms of cooperation, as does the artistic endeavor often, which can call for collaboration. I think in the printing context, we'll talk about that a little bit more. I was reading on one of the terrific wall texts about Leslie King Hammond's book, Black Printmakers and the WPA. And she discusses there how the fluid relationships between artists and the students and teachers kind of shake things around in the printmaking context. Roles freely shifted or merged, she writes, as teachers and students explored new technologies together. Rapid exchange of technical information, relentless exploration of various print media deconstructs the different roles and creates a community, right? A community of equals, a community of peers. Of course, the artistic spirit often, not always, but often, is driven by values such as creativity and ideas, not necessarily by the profit motive as in other industries, or at least not for all artists, or well, we know there are rapacious artists, and the art market is a whole other topic. But many artists, at least, are driven, at least at first, by something different, by a desire for creativity, for collaboration, and of course, politics. And I think these are the organic forces that pushed Robert Blackburn's workshop to become a cooperative with member fees, which actually is a very simple organizational structure. That's the third point I wanted to make. Cooperatives, like the workshop, are straightforward, easy forms of enterprises in which members govern the organization through democratic principles, one person, one vote, on certain principles that have been with cooperatives now for more than a century. The International Association of Cooperatives came up with principles for cooperatives about one person, one vote, democratic, autonomy, etc., back in 1859. But those principles make it very easy to have a members-based cooperative, a worker cooperative, or here an artist cooperative. Now, today the print shop is a nonprofit. It's been a nonprofit since 1971, but the way it functions today could work as well as a cooperative, in the sense that there continue actually to be member fees, member dues, which I think is about a third of the revenues, if I understood correctly. There continue to be classes and workshops, which are offered at the community print shop, which also generate revenue. There's also contract printing, sale of prints that are made at the workshop. So all of those were formerly and could easily be thought of through the structure of a cooperative, although the nonprofit form works as well. Although it's different and it has different strengths and weaknesses. I tend to put nonprofits within the category of kind of what I call coöperism. Depends on the nonprofit. Some nonprofits are extremely hierarchical, others are less. But there's a way in which you can think of it as a cooperative enterprise. Now, the final point I'll make, maybe as we gather here this evening, at a particular time in American history, right, of heightened exclusions, I would say, with the attack on everything from critical race theory, diversity, DEI, heightened attack on gender, women, on transgender persons, especially attacks on immigrants and anyone who does not appear to be a white citizen, attacks on leftist professors and anyone who would be against fascism, anyone who would speak of cooperation or socialism or other ideas. And I think organically, one of the best ways to deal with this kind of exclusionary situation in order to protect communities in times of attacks like this is to form communities, collaborations, cooperatives that support themselves through solidarity and that create economic sustainability. And I'm convinced that one of the things that we need to do more is to create more of these cooperative enterprises where we govern ourselves and set our own rules and standards and sustain ourselves economically. I don't view this as an exclusionary or an exclusive proposition in the sense that I'm not suggesting a separationist or an isolationist politics. It can go hand in hand with other forms of political interventions and efforts to change the world, but seems as if one central component, particularly at a time of exclusion, is creating community that can be self-sustaining. And in a way, I think all of the artwork that surrounds us is a product of that, of coming together, forming communities in the face of exclusion. So what's so remarkable is that there are so many collaborations and forms of cooperation that surround us. And we are in the midst of one right here that you wouldn't see otherwise. You might walk by 39th Street. You don't realize that there's this hub of cooperative energy going on. But it's actually all around us. We can find them in mutuals, in mutual aid that's going on in New York City. Cooperative food banks, cooperative food stores, cooperative housing, etc. One of the things that I try to do in the book, Cooperation, is to show how much cooperation surrounds us, and propose that we build on that to leverage them, combine them, consciously work in bringing them together so that their collective force is, of course, greater than the sum of all of the parts. I call this kind of a creation of a separate economic regime that I would call coöperism, a first step towards a transformed society. I think it's clearly within our capabilities. I think we're in the midst of it right here in this gallery. And I think we can be inspired by all of the work here and all of the effort that came with the printmaking workshop to see the strength of community, give ourselves the joy and resilience to continue fighting and struggling, particularly in moments like now. So that's what I wanted to kind of throw onto the table for conversation with my thanks.
Thank you. That was amazing. Is it okay if I have a question for you?
Yes, of course.
And then follow up with Professor Harcourt?
Yes. Yes.
Oh, can you
Just
hear
need
me?
to
Can you
talk.
hear me?
Bring it up.
I can hear myself. Essye, you've been deeply involved in the history of the Blackburn Workshop, as it manifests here for this exhibition. My question for you is, from your perspective, what did cooperation look like day to day at the print shop? And how did artists actually experience it in practice? And my follow-up question then, between Essye and Professor Harcourt is, Professor Harcourt, when you hear about a space like Blackburn's Workshop, where cooperation meant literally sharing a press, a studio, and skills, as well as an ethos of inclusivity, how does that resonate with your critiques? Do you see this as an example of cooperation that resists the forces of domination that you've pointed out? Or are there still risks of hierarchy, even in such spaces? So Essye, thank you for this exhibition, by the way. What does cooperation look like day to day, like on the ground, like at the printmaking workshop?
I'm just going to have to also state that I'm one of the organizers. There's also Jazmine Catasús, where we, we're thinking of these exhibitions. We have more coming up. Actually, one's included next fall with Amani Kangran there, and then and then there's also we found a curator and hired her. We wanted to keep this, I guess, a little more detached and analytical, to have someone that could come in and actually do this work. And then also having the labels, this is Ethel Renia's work. She's been involved in the print shop and our oral history project, and she also worked very closely in the archives of Camille Billups. So that's one form of cooperative working that's in this exhibition. Then there's the grant that went into it, where we're working alongside HC, that's our deputy director, and then there's the work that goes into making these prints, and this is also part of, I would say this is the day-to-day, which is cutting down Ademola Alubofola's print, and then it took probably assistance of a couple of interns who are getting training. I was thinking of when part of your book that I didn't realize there was a values and principles for cooperation. Is that what the ICI you were mentioning came up with in 1859,
something like that, yeah.
Yeah, so I was reading through that, and I think that training was also a big part of it. And so what you'll see is some of the videos or even some of the works that were made here are also with interns that later or today, someone was working in the shop on a contract job. And then it was going so well that she actually had to hire another former intern to assist in sponging the stone, because if you've done stone lithography, you have to keep the stone moist, otherwise it can dry up, and then that's where the greasy ink will go into the dry stone and distort the image. So having a sponging partner is maybe required unless you're super fast or have a small stone. You can do it yourself, but even then you need someone with clean hands. So there's some studios, if it's like Justin, if he's working with an artist that requires ink, he might have someone with clean hands, that can handle the paper. There's also a press bed that's quite wide, where you just need help laying down the blankets, or a large sheet of paper. So that would be the day-to-day, I would say. And then also, there's like lifting things, but there's something else.
Right. Well, I mean, it's interesting because there's as Bernard was mentioning, there's like a whole lot to the printmaking process, right? So like if we think about even like the early days when he literally became what's called a master printmaker, most of it being really from Europe or places like Germany here. Here we have a guy, Robert Blackburn, who becomes a master printmaker, and I suppose in a kind of an American way, he developed and established a community, the core community, or rather the core group being those of African American heritage from Harlem, of which many of these artists volunteered their labor to specialize in a part of the printmaking process, whether that's the paper or the ink, or the many elaborate parts of the machine assembly line cell in exchange for prints themselves. And so if that's part of the very early history here, and it became very successful as a very inclusionary enterprise, I'm wondering then, now we're here in 2025 and there's an amazing exhibition over the last 20 years that when you walk into the Robert Blackburn Printmaking Workshop, how does that division of labor work? Is it completely on a voluntary basis? You were mentioning, for example, like someone knows how to clean a certain stone lithographs with a certain kind of a sponge where someone may not know anything about it. When you have an accident, how do you deal with these kinds of things? How do the artists themselves, with their collective and shared labor, approach printmaking today at the workshop itself? Do you have any stories or?
Well, I mean, often what you see in the shop that we are often, when you're working with an artist, they have a certain kind of, limitations within their own work. And then there's some artists that have, it's very open. And so I guess when you're working with an artist, the master printer's job is to have that technique down and then experiment through proofing process. The artists that come through the print shop members are often printing for themselves. And they may not know, what's going on with the acid, or maybe they have applied a hard ground, and then people get involved in, figuring out things together. So there's often troubleshooting happening and talking about paper. Why isn't it picking up ink? But it's
not like you guys have like specialized roles, like in the mid 20th century or something like that. It's just that it's going to be more like certain artists, they're known for being really good at this area, and they receive help when they need that kind of a thing, right?
Yeah, I'd say so. Do you?
Yeah, so Kai, you ask a great question, which is, are there still risks of hierarchy even in such spaces? And yes, there are. And to a certain extent, I would say that cooperation or coöperism or cooperative enterprises are a constant struggle to achieve an ideal. But there's no denying that there are kind of entropic forces that make it a constant struggle and that kind of make it difficult, right? We are very much brought up and trained in hierarchical and competitive ways that make it particularly difficult to shed those. And so I think, cooperatives go through difficult periods. They go through demutualization at times, for financial reasons, for sometimes as a result of growth. One of the biggest cooperatives that we often refer to as the Mondragon consortium of cooperatives in the Basque Country in Spain. It's a huge consortium. It's got 74,000 members in all of the different cooperatives. And it's the 7th largest industrial group in Spain. And they make heavy equipment. They make refrigerators and ovens, and it's an industrial group formed by myriad numbers of cooperatives. Now, it's constantly a struggle to maintain the values of cooperatives in that context when you are that big and when you are such a big consortium. And it's easy to have tendencies towards demutualization or to have tendencies towards, outsourcing some of the work or hiring people to do work for a cooperative, and then all of those problems arise. Crédit Agricole in France is one of the biggest banks. It's a mutual. It's a credit union, agricultural credit union. It was one of the biggest in France. It assembles 39 banking cooperatives. And they ultimately kind of created a shell structure where they felt that they needed money so that the 39 banks continue as mutuals, but now they have a shell structure which does some public debt creation for them to support them and whatnot. So, those are always struggles. In any space, there are going to be these kinds of efforts. Now, the print shop is not now a cooperative. I mean, it was from 1956 to 1971. Right now, it's a more traditional nonprofit organization, which tends to have more designated roles. I mean, there's less. It's not member-owner cooperatives are a different thing, but what they strive towards are these 7 principles. So I thought I would just share the 7 principles, which have been around for a long time now, but they give you an idea of what they're trying to get at. The first is cooperation must be open. A cooperative must be open to all without discrimination based on voluntary membership, right? So it has a non-discriminatory element to it, which creates differences possibly with what Du Bois might have been trying to do in the early 20th century. Second, cooperative organizations should be run democratically by the members themselves. Members should have equal say and equal vote in the decision-making process, which of course is very different than other organizations. And here it doesn't depend on how many shares you have. It's not a 51% shareholder can decide everything. Here it's if you are a worker in a worker co-op, you have one vote among the other votes, right? You don't have a kind of a tiered voting system. It's like if you're a worker, you have a vote, period. And the CEO doesn't get 25 votes. Third, members should contribute and benefit equitably from the running of the enterprise. So the idea is that there needs to be equity within the enterprise. So for instance, that cashes out in a place like Mondragon to the fact that the salary ratio can't exceed 4.5 to 1. All right, now that's really low salary disparity between highest and least skilled worker, for instance. In the United States, the average is over 700 to 1. Large companies like McDonald's are at, above 3,000 to 1, right? An institution like Columbia University is probably pretty high up there, whatever. Mondragon is 4.5 to 1. That means the highest paid person. That's real equity. Fourth, cooperatives have to remain autonomous and self-determining under the control of the members only, so it can't have like outside influences. Fifth, they have to strive to provide training and education for the members. So there's a whole kind of training dimension to it, right? And sixth, there has to be cooperation among cooperative enterprises, which I try to build on. And then finally, the cooperative enterprises have to strive toward the sustainable development of their environment and communities. That's something we might want to talk about in the printmaking context, because it's probably not as easy in the printmaking context as in other contexts, since you deal with so many toxic solubles and whatnot. But there is this idea that part of being a cooperative is having a kind of a sustainability principle for the environment. So you put all those things together, and again, I think most cooperatives strive towards those goals and struggle with setbacks all the time. I think that's a model for what people refer to as, a sustainable economy.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for laying out those 7 principles. Before you mentioned that cooperation is everywhere. Mm-hmm. In fact, that there's a certain ubiquity with cooperation. And you mentioned at least the 7 characteristics that largely define what a cooperation is here. In this case, we have a case by which there's a nonprofit where it has a very formidable history, even as a small workshop that has survived and endured after all this that they have experienced, dating back 80 years at this point. So my question here for you is one. Can you say a little bit more about the ubiquity of cooperation, how it's all around us? And number 2 is that I'm just looking for a little more clarity here. This is also in relationship to the print shop, because you mentioned those characteristics. When I think of cooperation, I think of it more as like in a sense, a kind of an ism, maybe a coöperism, where it's more of an ethic, rather than just say these like specific characteristics that define what an organization like as a cooperative is. And my third question then is that because we have a nonprofit right now that harkens back to its original mission when it was clearly a cooperative, that even though it has changed as an entity, in this case very specifically a legal entity called the nonprofit, could it be the case that by harkening back to these original principles and its history and the kind of ethos that's clearly there at the Robert Blackburn Printmaking Workshop, that it has endured in large part because it originated as a cooperative?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm. Yeah, I mean, so there is a certain resilience on this last point. There is a certain resilience that goes with cooperation, and it's in part because the motivations and the ways of behaving of cooperatives are often different than for-profit institutions, and so there are studies that show, for instance, that during kind of the financial downturn, right, it was actually credit unions did better than many of the private banks, right? And there's studies that show the kind of greater longevity of cooperative enterprises in certain industries. In part, it makes sense, right? Because these are less risk taking entities, particularly in the banking context. I mean, a savings union or a credit union can be a relatively conservative entity that's not going to give you, a great return necessarily on your deposit compared to, say, some investment in junk bonds, but is probably going to be safer and invested in safer assets, right? So there are these questions of resilience which make them have longer lives, and which probably, I suspect accounted in part for the longevity of the Robert Blackburn Printmaking Workshop overall. But I did, in terms of your first question though, which is kind of all of the cooperation that does surround us, you don't see it when you're walking down 34th Street, okay? I was coming from, the 2-3, and it looked more like a shopping mall than what I remember. I grew up in New York City, so, but yeah, so it Foot Locker and all of that. But in terms of what we need for our own lives and well-being, it's not that hard to surround yourself entirely and to be completely ensconced in cooperative enterprises. Insurance, mutual insurance agencies are that's one of the areas where cooperation is really strongest. State Farm is a mutual, right? It's the policyholders who are the owners of the institution. It's not being run by a CEO in the same way as a private insurance company for profit. It is run by policyholders. And you can feel that sometimes, when you talk to a State Farm agent and a State Farm agency, which are like localized places, but Liberty Mutual, et cetera, they're the insurance industry, the banking industry. The Federal Navy Credit is one of the biggest deposit banks around. It's for Navy vets, but it's, I don't know what the size of it. It's huge. Food cooperatives. That's something that we need to work on more. There are some famous food cooperatives, in Park Slope and whatnot. There aren't enough, clearly. And in other countries, they're much better served. And you go, I spent a lot of time in France. There are food co-ops everywhere, basically, and it's a cooperative system. Housing cooperatives. Many of us actually live in housing cooperatives. Some of us are on the boards of our housing cooperatives and kind of deal with that there. One can think of many of, REI is a cooperative. So there are lots of, Ace Hardware is a retailer cooperative. Sunkist is a producer cooperative. Land O'Lakes is a producer cooperative. So it turns out that one can actually kind of try to find ways to kind of live differently in and with organizations that are much more bottom up than being top down, right? So it's not evident when you look out the window at, I don't know, CVS or whatever. But they are there, and it's not that hard to find them and to change the way you engage with the world, right? Sorry.
That was one thing that I thought when I was reading the book, that you had countless examples, and then I could start thinking of my own. And then you said several times, like, this can be done. This has been done. We have this laid out. It seemed, and then you were, I mean, I would like to go back to W.E.B. Du Bois, but because I'm also thinking about Bob's hesitancy to become a nonprofit for so long. And I think that the cooperative model that he had at that time, it just wasn't sustainable for him. And that there was so much funding at that point. And he was assisting, you know, Eleanor Magid opened the Lower East Side print shop. Some of you were at that program, Chris, filming, thanks. And he was assisting her in opening up the Lower East Side print shop. There was, you know, Tayer Barikwa. I mean, he was helping countless artist-run spaces becoming nonprofits where he was seeing that they were getting these large grants. Actually, Faith Ringgold, I'm pointing at her print over there, helped with one of the first large grants that Eleanor Magid got to purchase her Charles Brand press. I know Kai, but I know what you're thinking of.
Oh no, I was only wondering. It's not just the Lower East print shop, right? Lower East Printmaking Workshop. It's like it's kind of like Johnny Appleseed, right? Kind of going around the world spreading this model, right? Can you speak to a little bit about how he was kind of like Johnny Appleseed in places like India, in parts of Africa, and anything that you want to add to that?
Yes, so he was also an educator. He was the first African-American professor or teacher. I don't know if they were using professor, but at Cooper Union. And he had students also at many schools that he taught, NYU, Columbia, and then they would come by the printmaking workshop, and then some of them would actually, you know, go back to their home country, Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, Asila. I'm looking at Amani again. She's been doing a lot of research around that. But there's countless, I mean, yeah, and Lahore, the university there, and people, just basic things like getting a press on a boat to DR. And we are very grateful to have this, you know, these librarians that came in from Queens College that started going through these papers. And then I was able to ask a print shop elder, actually, she's not really an elder, but anyways, she came in really young. but yeah, she's like, I know where that press is because she's from DR and her teachers studied with Bob. And she was able to message and get in contact with her professors, so. But yeah, so I think there's probably so much more I don't even know about. I went to this, the Guanlan Biennial, print biennial in China, and I met people from around the world, Estonia and Japan, and everyone knew Bob Blackburn. And so, sorry. And so we have, in our archive, over 60 countries represented, so, yeah.
Oh, that's great.
Okay. Sorry.
I think did I miss a? I think that was all I wanted to say about kind of being surrounded by cooperation.
Could you speak a little bit more about the South-South cooperation as quote unquote with Blackburn?
What's South-South? What's the South?
Like the global South.
Oh, sorry. Yes. What? Yeah. So, I mean, I'm not sure specifically, but I was today. I was showing some work by Jamil Feni. There was M.F. Hussein, and then there's Krishna Reddy. There's a R.H. Win from Korea, South Korea. She was actually in the Carnegie International, but I learned from curators and researchers, such as the Graduate Center. Actually, I did want to mention that Bob's own work was written by Deborah Cullen, who did her dissertation at the Graduate Center, and this was part of my reach out when I contacted Catherine Carl at the James Gallery. but sorry, I'm a bit, yeah, so I mean, that was very much, part of, yeah, sorry.
I'm going to shift it a little bit, if that's okay, about art and art production here. Because you mentioned some of these things that we've heard about. For example, Land O'Lakes as being a cooperative, Ace Hardware is a cooperative. Normally, one would just think of these just more like, in a sense, mundane goods here. Here, we're talking about the enterprise of art. Here, I'm not saying that art is shouldn't be mundane. That's not what I'm saying. But in this world that we're in the so-called art world, there's this long history between just say, how can I frame this? Excluded people, socially excluded people that form these types of collectives. We call them art collectives here, by which they're gravitated towards types of mediums and practices that are not considered highbrow or high art. I can give a few examples here, if that's okay. One example's right in front of us, which is to say, there's a core group of African-American artists from Harlem gravitated towards the print medium, which is something maybe very democratic. It's editioned. It's oftentimes seen as a work on paper, as something preparatory for a painting or a copy of a painting, so on and so forth. So there's a certain kind of status with that. You can also say this about the story of art photography with women art collectives in the Weimar Republic here, or performance art with the Viennese actionists in the 60s. These are all different kinds of cases. But what I'm interested in here is that given the many accomplishments of innovation that happened at the Robert Blackburn Printmaking Workshop, is there something about these cooperatives by which a number of these people come from backgrounds that are excluded, that also lends towards innovation, in large part because they would move towards areas that are not as deemed as being, in this case, high culture. I think that when we normally think about normal goods or household goods or this kind of a thing, I mean, it seems to be fairly clear that under the capitalist ethos, if you will, that it's going to be the competition that's going to produce innovation. Is there something about, I'm wondering, in art, where we have a different circumstance? But I also want to ask then, can you give us examples of innovation that have been produced within cooperatives? Here in art, we can talk about innovation in terms of art's sake. Sorry.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that's actually a fascinating question, worth reformulating as a comment or an intervention than as something that I could answer. I'm not sure I have an answer. I just think that's a really fascinating idea. So I think there's no doubt that, I was trying to draw a link between exclusion and marginalization as fostering communities that then can operate in more egalitarian ways through cooperation, right? And that's what you're talking about specifically here. And one can think about it. I think there are examples of that. There are tons of examples of that, right? That forms of repression, often exclusion, etc., are productive in those ways, right? Not that one would then want to, foster those forms of exclusion in any way, but that they can be productive. think a little bit of the like Combahee River Collective, which, as you know, was a famous collective of Black women, lesbian women in the early 1970s, who wrote the Combahee River Collective statement in, I think it was 1971, right? Again, it was the forms of exclusion that brought them together to create a community, and then to basically have such avant-garde ideas, right? Intersectionality, actually, they had a theory of intersectionality. I mean, they things that have today become somewhat common in our language, in our political language, was invented there. So I think that, I mean, what you're putting your finger on is a phenomenon that is common throughout a number of domains, but never something that would be, in a way, desirable, right? It is the beautiful, productive outcome of a bad situation. Yeah.
I was thinking of Krishna Reddy's viscosity prints, being able to put multiple colors on a plate and pass it through the press, one pass. Usually with color it goes through the press multiple times. So that was very inventive, and actually something that you see in our archive as well, and the photographs. So the print collection and then the photographs, you see the people making the works, learning the technique with Krishna, and then you can actually pull the prints and you can see people sharing colors. You can see the rollers, because it takes a long time to clean a roller. So you're just like, oh, let me get some of that color, And so people are sharing the rollers and colors as well. So you see also silver ink can kind of pop up in this 1 year. I think it was between like Norman Lewis, which was probably Muhammad Khalil printing, I think. And then you see it a little bit with Betty Blayton, who was printing, but that was a very expensive ink. That's what someone told me. So people got really excited and they started sharing. But it's still, it's visualized. It's kind of insane. I don't know. But that's what I was thinking with innovation. Sorry. Okay.
Interesting.
But I think they were probably left alone because it was printmaking, which, And the first shaped canvas is actually at Clark, too, in Paris, where he was probably left alone to, to create that.
What areas, with this discussion, given Bernard's presentation about cooperation, about the characteristics of cooperatives, and how it's so ubiquitous, it's all around us, both in terms of, just say the ethos of it, the ways that it make these cooperatives are cooperatives. What do you think that you can take from this, as you work with your fellow members at the printmaking workshop, especially during a time when it's so repressive?
You mean in everything? I guess the arts. We're not making, patriotic art.
Specifically at the print shop.
Well, I think for us that are employed there, Justin, Jazmine, Nancy, myself, John Andrews is here. He's one day, but he's a real contract printer. He does all the gigs and teaches as well. So I think we do participate in sort of one vote. So usually Jazmine and I are on the same side, and then we outrank Justin because we just said this. But but I think what I would like to see and what I'm questioning in this exhibition and then this publication, reading the book, is how to be accountable to those stakeholders, being our membership, and seeing how we can best support them, how we can continue to collect work from our members to be part of this history. Those are the things that I'm thinking about. And while reading this is like how to be a better, the green thing, we gotta convince Jazmine because she likes her solvents. Sorry, did I already say that?
Oh, that's great. That's great. That's great.
I think I said that earlier.
Well,
Should we do questions?
sure. Q&A.
Do you want me to lead a Q&A?
I can do it. So, we're heading towards the close right now. We're in the queue with a question and answer session. Do any of you have a question here?
So should we pass the mic? Or
It doesn't pass though.
It doesn't pass?
Need the mic?
Yeah.
Won't reach?
Yeah. You don't have to come up, but if you can stand up and speak. And it's a small enough room.
Oh, it's not wireless. I see.
I'm very concerned with what's happening out there as a human rights attorney. On the 25th, President Trump issued a presidential
I
memorandum
think you turned it off.
about terrorism. Right.
Go for it.
President Trump issued a memorandum about terrorism. There are common recurrent motivations in indicia uniting this pattern of violent and terrorist activities under the umbrella of self-described anti-fascism. These movements portray foundational American principles, that is, support for law enforcement and border control, as fascists to justify and encourage acts of violent revolution. This anti-fascist lie has become the organizing rally cry used by domestic terrorists to wage a violent assault against democratic institutions, constitutional rights, and fundamental American liberties. Common threads animating this violent conduct include anti-Americanism and anti-capitalism and anti-Christianity. So any group, including co-ops, is going after 501c3s and co-ops. So I think it's really important to always see the role of these co-ops, but we're definitely under attack, in the book. So.
Yeah, no, completely. Yeah.
Also, I just want to say, as part of the co-ops, the Guild is fostering more co-ops across the board. Is the one way to fight back against this repression.
Yeah.
The
National Lawyers Guild, which does terrific work. I was trying to make a reference to that earlier in my talk about the ongoing attack on cooperation, in a sense. I mean, cooperation really is in opposition to competition, and generally understood as capitalist competition. And so part of the book was also to try and create a more contemporary argument for cooperation, because there have been historically different kind of strands. One of them is a separationist argument for cooperation, which was Du Bois's, but also in other contexts as well. Some of them were more evolutionary, so the notions that actually cooperation evolutionarily is more important than competition, which seems to me to be kind of impossible to, I wouldn't be able to prove that. But so how do we argue for cooperation today in a modern way, particularly in the face of these kind of attacks? But there's no doubt that defining Antifa or as anti-Christian and anti-capitalist, we're just kind of like lumping these things together in the way that only Trump is able to do is particularly dangerous and eliding all kinds of category distinction, such as the fact that domestic terrorism doesn't exist as a legal category, actually.
I have kind of a selfish question.
Congratulations, Amani. Got married today. Woo!
I'm not here to ask about my wedding. So I have kind of a selfish question. Essye mentioned that I was doing a project with the workshop on Bob's work in Morocco in 79 through around 85. And I'm really glad that you brought up Du Bois because, of course, Du Bois spent the latter part of his life and, of course, died in Ghana, a father of Pan-Africanism and very much a proponent of the cooperative organization of and post-colonial African nations. And I think to myself that a lot of Black print artists spring to mind as people who had active roles in the visual identity of decolonial and post-colonial movements, including Bob, who went to Morocco to work with Mohamed Malehi, but also people like Emery Douglas, who went to Algiers in '69 with Kathleen and Eldridge Cleaver, very much as a representative, the visual representative of the Black Panther Party. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about how you see, especially like Black collectivist artists as playing a role in decolonial, post-colonial spaces, and how I think especially their Blackness lends itself to that kind of international, transnational solidarity.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, thank you and congratulations again, and have fun. Yeah, you're pushing me outside of my expertise slightly, but that's okay. So I haven't studied as much the kind of the artist side of many of these movements, but I would say, and what your comment made me think of, is that, of course, the Black Panthers were a cooperative organization, right? And so actually, I've written a whole thing about the Black Panthers as a model of cooperation. Now, they put together a remarkable set of cooperative enterprises, whether it had to do with healthcare and or food banks or distribution of food, the free breakfast program for kids, which became a federal program. But if you look at their history, what they were in effect was a cooperative organization. It started, of course, as a self-defense organization, which itself was a cooperative effort, right? In other words, when it started, it was a question of arming oneself as a way to protect others, following the cops, watching the interactions, reading the criminal law out loud while a police interaction was taking place, right? That's what they were doing. Pretty amazing. Go ahead.
There's also kind of a remarkable similarity between some of the 10 points and the 7 points in terms of educational bolstering within the community for its membership.
Right, exactly, right. The 10-point program of the Black Panthers has a lot in common with the 7 points of cooperative associations.
And you should mention the young lords.
As well, right. Cooperation among all of the different anti-colonial and anti-establishment movements that were taking place at the time, right? That's another point of similarity, cooperation among the cooperation. But then all of the other programs, the ambulance program in North Carolina, right? I mean, all of these programs were forms of mutual aid, had an orientation that was perfectly within the fold of cooperation. So, yeah, that's what that was making me think of.
Oh, of course,
Yeah.
sorry.
Oh, no, I wasn't saying that.
Here we go.
So I've got two, thank you so much. I've
Sure.
got two questions, and so, but I'll give them to you, like, and you can ignore one or just take your pick or do both. So the first one, I'm very curious, Bernard. We're in a strange moment politically over the last 10, 15 years where a lot of the social and artistic forms that have been historically associated with the left have been also taken over by the right. And I'm thinking of transgressive modes of making art or interventions, of dealing with disruptiveness and so on. And so I was wondering about cooperation, and because everything you're saying has an implicit connection over to socialism or to a leftist politics. And I wondered if anywhere in your research you'd encountered right-leaning cooperative organizations.
Okay.
And then the second one is it's about a kind of terminology slippage over the course of this conversation, which has been great. Which is, cooperation, collaboration, collective, cooperative as an economic structure versus maybe some of the things you're describing are more collaboration and cooperation, the noun. And then I noticed looking at your table of contents in your book, and you also mentioned the word cooperism. So I wondered if you could quickly define cooperism for us and and why you needed a new term. What's it compensating for in relationship to all of these other terms and the way they slide into each other?
Okay, great. Thanks so much. So on the first one, I tend to feel as if the first principle of cooperatives, which is the non-exclusion, right? The fact that it's got to be open to everyone, tends for me to do the work of excluding right or extreme right forms of cooperation. So there's no doubt that there are forms of cooperation within the right. So there's no doubt, right? But I think that they would have a hard time satisfying the first principle, particularly when it's so openly xenophobic, or if it's so openly excluding persons of color or non-Christians or something like that, right? So that's how I deal with that problem, which is a real problem. In other words, I rarely think that a concept cannot allow itself to be used by the other side, as they say, right? I mean, we have Gramscian. Do we have a?
Well, I'm curious, is building up with Claire, how you would define evangelicism, because that feels like the evangelical movement has done such a really horrific job. It is its own community, and it has its own values, and we can look at the proliferation of it with Charlie Curtin, what just happened. And so I think that they might identify them. They wouldn't use necessarily the word cooperative or cooperation, but there is such a deep and implicit, and it's in so many ways like they are. And I'm not sure what word I want to use, but it's a cycle that works, right? And it's kind of. So I'm wondering, like, if it's important for us to think about how the right is using cooperation and cooperative, because it's there. And there's a history of the left, like from Boston when they were trying to desegregate schools. And then the right came in, the racists came in, and they used desegregation to then create segregation. So like I think it's necessary
Yeah. No, I definitely think it's tricky. It always is with concepts. I mean, I was going to say, the Gramscian strategies have definitely been taken over by the right explicitly, right? So they claim to be Gramscian, So I mean, you can see this slippage in the way in which, ideas can transfer. But I still think that, I mean, I don't know. I'll test this out. You guys can tell me what you think. But I don't think that those evangelical associations, et cetera, would consider themselves open to anyone and willing to have one person, one vote in determining the direction of the organization, right? Now, so there's always been a deep link between democratic principles and leftist thought. Some think Marx was actually just a Republican, a Democrat, a Republican, right? It was about democracy. But I think if you're going down the path of cooperation, you need to really maintain that openness and that equality, which actually might be dangerous. It might lead to the end of cooperative, or the end of your cooperative in the way you were thinking. I mean, there are dangers associated with that too. Obviously, if people who are coming in have kind of exclusionary ideas of their own. Now, just quickly on the second, because I know other people want to jump in. Sergio, you got your hand up. But so the idea of coöperism was to try and find a way to think about this as a political economy, as a full-blown political economy. So not just to be in favor of a cooperative here and a mutual there, but to think of how you could establish a sustainable economy based entirely on forms of cooperation, which would then be a competing model to the other isms, whether it's capitalism or socialism, in the sense that coöperism, as I imagine it, actually is entirely bottom up. It's not a system that gets imposed from the top. The equality is not going to be imposed from the top. So it is very different than forms of socialism. It's not a nationalized now. I mean, where it might lead, I don't know. I think I view it as a step, but it's not nationalized. It's not the industries aren't nationalized. No, they are turned into cooperatives so that the people who are working in there are the owners. So, so the idea of coöperism was to think of it as a full regime. And there were moments in history when others argued for this. There were moments in history, I mean, big debates within Marxism as to the advantages of worker cooperatives or not, generally frowned upon from a Marxist perspective, although Lenin kind of came back to it towards the end of his life in 1923 in a couple of essays on cooperation, seemed to be changing his mind. I mean, so there's been long history about debates over this, but I do view it as potentially a full-blown economic system regime. Yeah, so that's why, yeah. And then other people have used other words for it. Cooperationism was one term, but anyway, I thought coöperism worked. Yeah.
Thank you. I want to ask,
Sorry.
did you find some of the cooperatives that create some sort of resistance?
Some of the what?
Cooperativism.
Yeah.
The cooperativism work that in some extent create like some resistant contra-hegemonic education that endure, that create new institutions that last. Because I feel that many cooperatives was historically captured by individualism, competitiveness, or externally competing with other cooperatives and then capitalistic industry, or like internally, like for example, hiring and exploit all the workers that are outside the cooperative in Italy things. And I think when I think on this, I think, for example, the MTST, the landless movement in Brazil, and the school that they have for training all the people that are inside the movement.
Right.
Did you find these kinds of examples in America and Europe also?
Well, actually, America is pretty underdeveloped in terms of cooperatives compared to Europe, or compared to Brazil. I mean, you're mentioning the landless workers movement in Brazil, which is enormous. 1.5 million households. So it's an enormous movement that takes over uncultivated lands and turns it into agricultural collectivities and cooperatives, multifamily cooperatives, right? And that actually gains title to the land by going to court in Brazil, right? And claiming that the land was not used, and therefore, under Brazilian law, they're entitled to take it over. That's huge. We are relatively behind other areas, nations and areas, far more cooperatives in Italy, in Spain, than in the United States. New York City has one of the biggest worker cooperatives, which is a home health care cooperative, which started in the Bronx and now it operates in many of the boroughs. And that's about 2,000 workers, home health care workers. And I think that's the biggest worker cooperative in this country. Agricultural cooperatives is what has traditionally been the space where they have grown the most. And usually states will have cooperative statutes to incorporate as a cooperative just for agriculture. But you can think of public utilities, a lot of electric cooperatives or public utility cooperatives in the US. Yeah, but I would say, I would say that we are a little bit behind other countries in that respect.
This is George Shear, Executive Director of Elizabeth Foundation for the Arts.
So with that, I'll try to frame a little bit. Thank you. This has been fantastic. Thank you, Essye. Thank you for pulling this together. So I hope this will build a little bit on the conversation that questions that Claire's brought forward, and some of what you're talking about the political economy around cooperatives. And going to the original Boy's quote, it really tied quite beautifully the cooperative structure and the monetary community autonomy with a politics of solidarity, which is where he ended that. Mm-hmm. If you can dig more into that politics of solidarity in relationship to the cooperative structure, and I'd like to frame that just a little bit in terms of what Essye was bringing forward, which is perhaps Bob's hesitancy to move into the nonprofit realm. I just got back from DC celebrating the 60th anniversary of the National Endowment for the Arts, organized by Americans for the Arts and by the national agencies of our state arts agencies. And I can say that among the technocratic understanding of what the NEA has done to build an arts infrastructure over the last 60 years, no one had a strategy to deal with the authoritarianism of this moment. Mm-hmm. The lack of a strategy is really concerning. I would also maybe say my sense in the organization, that when Bob brought the print shop to EFA, not only was his health poor, but I think that there was some sense that the organization itself was relatively weak, and that in some ways what was there was a maybe something like a politics of stewardship rather than a politics of solidarity that was able to bring it forward in the structure of the court. And there's lots of critique, of course, about the nonprofit structure undermining the cooperative, specifically undoing its structures and its monetary autonomy, shifting toward charitable purpose, private interest, government funding, to create more organized structures away from this solidarity, mutual aid, and other forms that communities who've had nothing done a lot with. So if you could talk about the politics of solidarity, Walker, that'd be great.
Great. Thanks. All right. So there's a lot there, and let me say. I'll say a few things. I think you may be more of an expert at this and have more to bring on the table. So it was fascinating what you were saying. It seems to me as if the nonprofit model in this country functions predominantly by means of the tax exemption, of the tax exempt contribution, right? I mean, that's how it works. In other words, the way to funnel individual persons' charitable and solidaristic intuitions is through getting a tax benefit for a contribution to nonprofits. And in a way, I think that undermines the concept of solidarity that is at the heart of the enterprise. And it means that within nonprofit organizations, the notion of solidarity is not so much built into them as something that needs to be cultivated by the individuals who are working in those institutions. It's more of a chosen thing, the solidarity that can emerge. In part because it's operating really on the model of trying to get people to contribute for their benefit, for the tax deductions. So I think that creates the problems that make that, in a way, that we're in right now. When you add to it, of course, the government funding that supports a lot of nonprofit work through grants, et cetera, and the turn that we've taken towards authoritarianism, then you've really got a big problem. Somehow it seems as if the cooperative form is able to nurture that solidarity in a different way, and maybe in a more lasting way or a more robust way, since it's kind of tied into the very principles of the organization itself. The non-hierarchy, the equal voting participation, which makes cooperatives a very taxing enterprise. It can make cooperatives a very taxing enterprise. One of the, it's a taxing enterprise in part, I think, because we aren't necessarily that good at democratic decision-making and democratic decision-making processes. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is that we only really experience it a very small portion of our lives, which is at the moment of election. And even then, right, one doesn't really feel as if one has a voice when one votes. But that is a moment of democratic participation. One of the things that I think coöperism would do would be to enforce democratic participation in all aspects of our lives, in our employment, in our consumption, and that would in a way, exercise our abilities. I don't think we're well exercised in democratic decision-making because we don't experience it that much in our lives. Families are notably not very democratic, right? And the workplace is oftentimes not democratic. For most workers, it's entirely non-democratic, completely hierarchical. Everything else one encounters is not democratic. So it's hard to see how we would kind of gain that muscle for making it work. That would be another kind of advantage related to solidarity of the cooperative form over the nonprofit form, I think. Yeah.
One last question? Anyone?
I think we should wrap up.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Yes,
Well, thank you. Thanks, Kai, for moderating this. Thank you for coming out. Appreciate it. Thank you, Essye.